My name is Serafina Mitchell, and I'm 18 years old. Last Tuesday, during what I thought was just another family dinner, my parents delivered news that shattered everything I believed about fairness, love, and family loyalty. As I sat their fork halfway to my mouth, they casually announced that college wasn't in my future, because girls don't need expensive educations. But my twin brother Ethan deserved their full financial support, including a brand new $300,000 Lamborghini for his graduation gift. The betrayal cut so deep that I couldn't even process the magnitude of their favoritism until later that night, when I discovered a family secret that would change everything forever. Before we dive into the story of family vengeance that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood loyalty, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? If you're ready for a wild ride of justice, served cold and karma coming full circle, smash that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss how this family drama unfolds. The twists ahead will shock you just as much as they shocked me. Growing up as Ethan's twin sister was like living in someone else's shadow 24/7. From the moment we could walk, the difference in treatment was crystal clear, but I was too young to understand how toxic it really was. While I got hand-me-down clothes from cousins and generic birthday gifts, Ethan received the latest designer everything and elaborate birthday parties with professional entertainers. My parents, Margaret and Robert Mitchell, owned a successful chain of automotive dealerships across 3 states. Money was never the issue. Their priorities were, when Ethan showed interest in baseball at age 7, they immediately enrolled him in the most expensive private coaching program in the state, complete with personal trainers and nutritionists. When I expressed interest in violin lessons, they bought me a $50 plastic instrument from Walmart and told me to figure it out yourself. The academic disparity was even worse. Ethan struggled with basic math throughout elementary school, so my parents hired a team of tutors and enrolled him in specialized learning programs that cost thousands per month. Meanwhile, I was maintaining straight A's completely on my own, and when I asked for help with advanced chemistry, they told me I was smart enough to handle it alone. High school amplified everything. Ethan barely scraped by with C's and D's, but every mediocre report card was celebrated like he'd cured cancer. My consistent honor roll achievements were met with indifference or worse, criticism about how I needed to be more well-rounded like my brother. They attended every single one of his baseball games, even the away games that required overnight travel, but missed my debate team championships and academic award ceremonies because they were too busy. The college application process revealed the true depth of their favoritism. While I spent months crafting essays, studying for the SAT, and researching scholarships, my parents were secretly hiring expensive college consultants for Ethan. They paid for multiple SAT prep courses, professional essay writers, and even donation consultations with prestigious universities. I discovered this when I accidentally opened a bill addressed to my father, $85,000 for educational consulting services for Ethan's college applications. When I confronted them about the disparity, their response was chilling. Ethan needs more support because he's going to carry on the family business. You'll just get married and have babies anyway. The casual dismissal of my potential, my dreams, and my worth as a human being felt like a physical blow. That's when I started paying closer attention to the family dynamics I'd normalized for 18 years. I noticed how they bragged about Ethan to their friends while rarely mentioning me at all. I saw how they displayed his participation trophies prominently throughout the house, while my academic achievements were shoved in a drawer. I realized that every family photo in their office featured Ethan prominently, while I was either cropped out or positioned in the background. The most painful realization was understanding that this wasn't just favoritism. It was systematic emotional abuse disguised as traditional family values. They had convinced themselves that investing in their son's future while neglecting their daughter's was not only acceptable but admirable. The dinner conversation that destroyed my world was just the final confirmation of what I'd been living with my entire life. The family dinner that changed everything started so normally that the contrast makes it even more surreal in hindsight. Mom had made her signature pot roast. Dad was in a particularly good mood after closing a major dealership deal, and Ethan was rambling about his graduation party plans. I was actually feeling optimistic because I'd just received my acceptance letter to MIT with a partial scholarship, something I was planning to share during dessert. "So, kids," Dad said, cutting into his meat with the satisfied expression of a man about to deliver good news, "your mother and I have been discussing your futures and we've made some important decisions." My heart raced with excitement. Maybe they'd finally recognized my achievements. Maybe they were going to surprise me with college support after all. The naive hope in my chest felt warm and bright. "Ethan," Mom continued, her voice filled with pride, "we've decided to pay for your entire college experience. Tuition, room and board, spending money, everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I smiled, assuming this meant I'd receive similar support. Twins meant equal treatment, right? And Dad added with a dramatic pause, "We've also decided to buy you that Lamborghini Huracan you've been admiring. Consider it a graduation gift for making it through high school." The number $300,000 hung in the air like a neon sign. I knew the exact price because Ethan had been obsessing over that specific car for months, showing us pictures and videos daily. But Mom turned to me with an expression I can only describe as dismissive pity. "Serafina, we've decided that college isn't the right path for you. You're a smart girl, but higher education is expensive, and frankly, it's not a good investment for someone who's just going to get married and have children." The words hit me like physical blows. "What do you mean it's not a good investment? Women don't need expensive degrees," Dad stated, matter-of-factly, as if he was discussing the weather. "You can get a perfectly good job with a high school diploma, maybe take some community college courses if you really want to learn something practical like nursing or teaching." "But I got into MIT," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my world crashing down. "That's nice, sweetheart," Mom said with the tone you'd use to praise a child's finger painting, "but MIT costs almost $80,000 a year. That money would be much better spent ensuring Ethan has every advantage in business school." Ethan, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Wait, Sarah got into MIT. That's actually pretty cool." For a brief moment, I felt grateful for even that small acknowledgement. "It doesn't matter," Dad snapped, his good mood evaporating. "She's not going." End of discussion. The casual cruelty of that moment. The way they dismissed the biggest achievement of my life, while simultaneously handing my brother a luxury car worth more than most people's houses, crystallized 18 years of unequal treatment into one devastating reality check. "You're spending $300,000 on a car for him but won't invest in my education," I asked, my voice stronger now, fueled by disbelief and growing anger. "The car is an investment in Ethan's image," Mom explained, as if this made perfect sense. "When he takes over the dealerships, he needs to look successful. First impressions matter in business. And my education isn't an investment in my future. Your future is being a wife and mother," Dad said firmly. "No man wants to marry a woman who thinks she's smarter than him. You'll thank us for this someday." The dinner table fell silent except for the sound of Ethan uncomfortably shifting in his chair. I looked around at my family. my parents beaming with satisfaction at their practical decision-making, my brother avoiding eye contact, and realized I was completely alone. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. If my family wanted to play favorites, if they wanted to treat me like a second-class citizen in my own home, then they were about to learn that their disappointing daughter had been paying attention to a lot more than they realized. The week following that disastrous dinner, I became a detective in my own home. Years of being overlooked had given me an unexpected advantage. My parents barely noticed my presence, which meant I could observe and investigate without raising suspicion. What I discovered in their home office would have been unbelievable if I hadn't found the evidence myself. It started with something relatively minor. While cleaning their office as part of my regular chores, another inequality. Ethan never had to do housework. I noticed a file cabinet drawer that was always locked. Curiosity got the better of me, and after some searching, I found the key taped under Dad's desk drawer. What I found inside that cabinet would fuel my revenge plan for months. The first shocking discovery was the extent of their wealth. The financial documents I found revealed that my parents weren't just comfortable, they were millionaires several times over. The dealership business was more successful than they'd ever let on, with annual profits exceeding $2.3 million. They owned investment properties, stock portfolios, and offshore accounts that I never knew existed. But the real bombshell was a folder labeled Ethan, Special Considerations. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. My brother hadn't just received preferential treatment. He'd been actively covering up serious legal troubles with my parents' money and influence. There were receipts for payments to attorneys, court officials, and even victims of incidents I'd never heard about. The most damning document was a police report from last year. Ethan had been arrested for drunk driving and had hit a parked car, injuring the elderly woman inside. Instead of facing consequences, my parents had paid $150,000 to the victim to avoid pressing charges, and had donated $50,000 to the police department's community outreach program. The charges were quietly dropped, and Ethan never even lost his license. There were more incidents, property damage at his school, that my parents secretly paid for, allegations of cheating on SATs that were resolved with a generous donation to the testing company, and even a sexual harassment complaint from a sued classmate that was settled out of court for $75,000. Each time my parents had swooped in with their checkbook, ensuring their golden boy never faced real consequences for his actions. But the most devastating discovery was a document titled Estate Planning, Inheritance Distribution. According to their will, Ethan was set to inherit the entire family business, all properties, and 95% of their liquid assets. I was allocated a mere $50,000, barely enough to cover a year of college tuition. The document included a note in my father's handwriting: Serafina's small inheritance should be sufficient for a wedding and initial household setup. As I photographed these documents with my phone, my hands shaking with rage and betrayal, I realized the true scope of my family's hypocrisy. They weren't just playing favorites, they were systematically ensuring that their son could commit crimes without consequences, while planning to leave their daughter with essentially nothing. The final piece of evidence was the most personally painful. Hidden in the back of the folder was a letter I'd written to my parents when I was 12, expressing my dreams of becoming a scientist and thanking them for always supporting my education. In the margins, my mother had written notes like unrealistic expectations and needs reality check about women's roles. They had kept my childhood letter not as a cherished memory, but as something to mock. That night, I sat in my room surrounded by copies of these documents, feeling a cold determination settle over me. My parents thought they could manipulate control and diminish me while elevating their precious son above the law itself. They thought I was just a naive girl who would accept their scraps and be grateful for the privilege. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The plan that began forming in my mind wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about exposing the truth, ensuring justice for their victims, and claiming the future I deserved. If they wanted to play dirty, they were about to discover that their overlooked daughter had inherited more than just their intelligence. I had inherited their ruthless business instincts too. And unlike Ethan, I was smart enough to use them legally. The game was about to change, and for the first time in 18 years, I was going to be the one making the rules. I spent the next several days meticulously organizing every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Each document was scanned, categorized, and uploaded to multiple secure cloud storage accounts. I created detailed timelines linking each covered-up incident to corresponding financial transactions. The pattern of corruption was so clear that even a first-year law student could build a case from what I'd assembled. But I wasn't satisfied with just having evidence. I needed to understand exactly what crimes had been committed and what penalties they carried. I spent hours in the public library researching federal sentencing guidelines for tax evasion, state laws regarding bribery of public officials, and civil liability for conspiracy to obstruct justice. What I learned made me realize that my parents weren't just morally corrupt. They were facing potential decades in prison if their activities were properly prosecuted. The research also revealed something that made my blood boil even more. Several of Ethan's victims had been denied justice not just by my parents' money, but by a system that allowed wealth to purchase silence. The drunk driving victim had been told by police that pursuing charges would be difficult and expensive, while the sexual harassment victim had been pressured by school administrators to accept a settlement rather than face a messy public trial. My parents hadn't just failed me as a daughter. They had actively participated in denying justice to innocent people whose only crime was being harmed by their precious son. This revelation transformed my motivation from personal revenge to something much more powerful, a genuine desire to ensure that their victims finally received the justice they deserved. I wasn't just going to expose my family's hypocrisy. I was going to make sure that every person they'd silenced with money finally had their voice heard. The next month became the most intensive period of planning and preparation of my life. Every day after school, while my parents celebrated Ethan's acceptance to a mediocre business program achieved through their donations, not his merit, I was methodically building a case that would expose their corruption and secure my future. My first step was research. I spent hours in the public library and online learning about legal precedents for the issues I'd discovered. The drunk driving cover-up wasn't just morally wrong, it was obstruction of justice. The bribery of school officials constituted fraud. The systematic financial discrimination could be challenged legally, especially since their business was partially built on my labor. I'd been working unpaid in their offices since I was 14, filing documents and managing inventory. I also discovered that several of the incidents they'd covered up were still within the statute of limitations for both criminal and civil proceedings. The victim of Ethan's drunk driving accident had the right to know that her settlement came with a non-disclosure agreement that might not be legally enforceable if it was hiding criminal activity. My second step was securing my own future. I couldn't wait for justice to be served. I needed to ensure I could survive whatever fallout came from exposing my family. I reached out to MIT's financial aid office and explained my situation in carefully chosen words. When they learned that my parents were refusing to provide financial support despite their wealth, a sympathetic counselor helped me apply for emergency independent student status and additional need-based aid. I also started working every available hour at the local bookstore, saving every penny I earned. My parents assumed I was just keeping busy and were actually pleased that I was learning appropriate work habits for my station in life. They had no idea I was building my escape fund. The third step was the most dangerous: gathering additional evidence. I began volunteering to help with more office work at the dealerships, which gave me access to business computers and financial records. I discovered that the corruption went even deeper than personal favors for Ethan. My parents had been systematically cheating on their taxes, hiding income through shell companies, and even bribing local officials to ignore environmental violations at their lots. Each piece of evidence was carefully photographed and uploaded to a secure cloud account they couldn't access. I created detailed timelines, cross-referenced documents, and built a comprehensive file that would make a prosecutor's job incredibly easy. But I wasn't just building a legal case. I was planning a public relations nightmare for them. My parents prided themselves on their reputation in the community. Dad served on the city council, Mom was president of the country club, and they both made generous public donations to maintain their image as pillars of society. The contrast between their public persona and their private corruption would make this story irresistible to local media. I also reached out anonymously to the victims of Ethan's covered-up crimes. Using a fake email account, I contacted the drunk driving victim, the sexually harassed classmate, and others, providing them with information about their rights and resources for seeking justice. I couldn't force them to act, but I could ensure they knew the truth about what had happened to them. The most challenging part of my plan was timing. I needed to wait until after my MIT financial aid was secured and my parents had followed through on their promises to Ethan. If I moved too early, they might find ways to sabotage my college plans out of spite. If I waited too long, statute of limitations issues might complicate the legal ramifications. I decided the perfect moment would be Ethan's graduation party. My parents were planning a massive celebration inviting everyone important in their social and business circles. They would be at their most confident, most publicly exposed, and most vulnerable to having their hypocrisy revealed. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't going to plant evidence or lie about anything. I was simply going to tell the truth, all of it backed up by their own documents at the moment when it would cause maximum legitimate consequences for their actions. 3 days before the graduation party, everything was in place. My MIT enrollment was confirmed with financial aid, my evidence was organized and backed up in multiple locations, and I had contacted a local investigative journalist who was very interested in a story about corruption and privilege. I'd even secretly recorded conversations with my parents where they made damaging admissions about their illegal activities. As I watched my parents bustling around, preparing for their celebration of their perfect son, I felt a cold satisfaction. They thought they were throwing a party to celebrate their success at molding Ethan into their ideal heir while successfully suppressing their problematic daughter. They were actually throwing a party to celebrate their own downfall. The countdown to justice had begun, and my family had no idea what was coming. Ethan's graduation party was everything my parents had envisioned. A lavish celebration showcasing their wealth and social status. The country club's grand ballroom was decorated with expensive floral arrangements. A full bar served top-shelf liquor, and a string quartet provided elegant background music. Over 200 guests mingled, including city council members, fellow business owners, country club elite, and extended family members who rarely saw behind the Mitchells' perfect facade. I had spent the morning helping with final preparations, playing the role of the dutiful daughter one last time. My parents were practically glowing with pride as they showed off Ethan's graduation photos and casually mentioned the Lamborghini waiting in the parking lot as his surprise gift. The contrast between their celebration of his mediocre achievements and their dismissal of my MIT acceptance the previous month made several family members uncomfortable, but no one dared say anything. The evening began exactly as planned. Dad gave a toast praising Ethan's perseverance and character, while Mom tearfully recounted his journey through adversity, conveniently omitting how they'd paid to eliminate every actual adversity he'd faced. Ethan basked in the attention, completely oblivious to what was coming. At exactly 8 p.m., as dessert was being served, I stood up and approached the microphone. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'd like to share some words about my family tonight." My parents looked pleased, assuming I was finally going to play the supportive sister role they'd always expected. Several guests smiled encouragingly, probably thinking it was sweet that the overlooked twin was getting a moment to shine. As many of you know, my parents have always been very focused on success and achievement. They've taught me valuable lessons about consequences, accountability, and the importance of earning what you receive. Nods and murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Dad actually winked at me clearly, thinking I was setting up some heartwarming tribute. That's why I think it's important for everyone here to understand exactly what kind of achievement we're celebrating tonight. I pulled out my phone and began reading from my carefully prepared notes. 3 months ago, my parents told me that they couldn't afford to send me to college despite my acceptance to MIT with honors. They explained that education for women isn't a good investment. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. Several guests looked confused while others began to look uncomfortable. However, they found $300,000 to purchase my brother's graduation gift, that beautiful Lamborghini outside, plus unlimited funding for his college experience. When I asked about this disparity, they explained that women don't need expensive educations because we're just going to get married and have babies anyway. Now the room was dead silent except for the string quartet who continued playing obliviously in the corner. But here's what's really interesting about the values my family has taught me about earning what you receive. I pressed a button on my phone and my voice filled the room from the speakers, a recording of my father from the previous week. Of course, we covered up the drunk driving thing. What were we supposed to do? Let him ruin his future over one mistake? That old lady was fine anyway, and the money wasn't that much considering what it could have cost us. The silence that followed was deafening. Several guests began looking around nervously, while others stared at my parents in shock. That was my father discussing how they paid $150,000 to cover up my brother's drunk driving accident last year. I explained calmly. The same brother we're celebrating tonight for his character and perseverance. My mother's face had gone completely white. Dad was starting to stand up, but I continued before he could interrupt. But that's not all. Over the past month, I've discovered that my family has spent over $400,000 covering up my brother's various legal troubles, including sexual harassment, settlements, academic fraud, and property damage. Meanwhile, they've told me repeatedly that they can't afford my education. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out as guests began texting or recording. The mayor, who was sitting at the head table, looked absolutely mortified. The most interesting discovery was their tax records, which show systematic fraud and bribery of local officials. I've spent the last month documenting everything, and copies of all evidence have been provided to the District Attorney's Office, the IRS, and several investigative journalists. At this point, chaos erupted. My father lunged toward the microphone, screaming about lies and family loyalty, while my mother began sobbing hysterically. Ethan stood frozen in place, finally understanding that his cushioned world was collapsing around him. But I wasn't finished. "The most heartbreaking part of this whole experience," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "was discovering that my parents have known about my dreams and abilities for years. I found a letter I wrote them when I was 12, expressing my love for science and thanking them for supporting my education. My mother had written notes in the margins, calling my dreams unrealistic and saying I needed a reality check about women's roles. The room erupted again, this time with genuine outrage from many of the center-lated female guests. The country club president looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. So while my parents taught my brother that he could commit crimes without consequences as long as they had enough money to cover it up, they taught me that my gender meant I didn't deserve the same opportunities despite earning them, through actual merit rather than family wealth. As security began moving toward the microphone, I delivered my final words. I start at MIT this fall, fully funded by financial aid and scholarships. I'll be studying engineering just like I dreamed when I was 12. And unlike some people here tonight, I earned every penny of support I'm receiving. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Half the guests left immediately, many stopping to express support for me as they departed. The other half stayed to witness the spectacular meltdown of two of the community's most prominent citizens. Local news crews arrived within an hour. Apparently, someone had live-streamed my entire speech. By midnight, Mitchell family scandal was trending locally on social media. The district attorney had issued a statement about opening an investigation, and my parents were hiding in the country club's back office, frantically calling their lawyers. The perfect family image they'd spent decades crafting had been destroyed in 15 minutes of truth-telling. Justice wasn't just served, it was served publicly, humiliatingly, and completely. The aftermath of that graduation party was more dramatic than I could have ever imagined. Within 48 hours, the local news had picked up the story, and by the end of the week, national media outlets were calling it a perfect example of family justice gone viral. The hashtag Mitchell Family Truth had spread beyond our small community, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of family favoritism and gender discrimination. My parents tried damage control, of course. They hired expensive public relations consultants and attempted to paint me as a disgruntled teenager seeking attention. But the evidence I'd gathered was too comprehensive and damning. The recorded conversations, financial documents, and legal papers spoke for themselves. When their lawyers reviewed everything I'd compiled, they strongly advised immediate plea negotiations rather than fighting charges that would likely result in prison time. The legal consequences came swiftly. The district attorney's office filed charges for tax evasion, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The IRS began a full audit of their businesses, while the state licensing board opened investigations into the dealership's operations. Within a month, my parents were facing potential prison sentences and millions in fines and back taxes. But the social consequences were perhaps even more devastating for people who had built their identities around community reputation. Dad was immediately removed from the city council pending investigation. Mom was asked to resign from the country club board and every charity organization she'd been involved with. Their social circle evaporated overnight as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. The business suffered too. Several major automotive manufacturers terminated their dealership agreements after the corruption charges became public. Customers stopped coming to lots associated with fraud and cover-ups. Within 6 months, my parents were forced to sell most of their dealerships at significant losses to pay legal fees and satisfy tax liens. Ethan's consequences were perhaps the most satisfying to witness. His college admission was revoked when the university learned about the donations and grade manipulation. The Lamborghini was repossessed when Dad's assets were frozen. Most importantly, several of his previous victims came forward with new civil lawsuits now that his crimes were public knowledge. He went from golden child to liability overnight. As for me, the best revenge was living well. MIT welcomed me with full financial aid, and the publicity from my story actually led to additional scholarship offers from organizations supporting women in STEM fields. I started college debt-free, and with a support network I never could have imagined. The media attention also brought unexpected opportunities. I was invited to speak at conferences about family dynamics and financial abuse. Several publishing houses reached out about writing a book about my experience. Most importantly, I heard from hundreds of young women who had been inspired to challenge unfair treatment in their own families. My freshman year at MIT exceeded every dream I'd had as a 12-year-old writing that letter to my parents. I thrived in advanced engineering courses, joined research projects, and built friendships with brilliant people who valued intelligence over gender stereotypes. The professors who had seen the news coverage were incredibly supportive, and I quickly became involved in mentoring programs for other first-generation college students. The inheritance issue resolved itself when my parents were forced to liquidate most of their assets to pay legal fees and settlements. By the time the estate was settled, there wasn't much left anyway. But honestly, I didn't need their money anymore. I had built my own future through merit determination and the kind of character they tried to teach Ethan but had never bothered to recognize in me. Looking back now, 18 months after that graduation party, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about the power of truth and the importance of standing up for yourself, even when the power of graduation, people who should love you unconditionally, refuse to see your worth. My parents spent 18 years trying to convince me that I was worth less than my brother because of my gender. They used their wealth and influence to shield him from consequences while denying me opportunities. They planned to leave me with scraps while giving him everything. But here's what they never understood. You can't keep someone down who refuses to accept that they belong there. You can't diminish someone who knows their own value. And you definitely can't silence someone who has truth on their side and the courage to speak it. Today, I'm thriving at one of the world's top universities, studying exactly what I dreamed of as a child. Ethan is working at a fast food restaurant, finally learning what consequences feel like. My parents are still dealing with legal issues and social exile. The family that refused to invest in my future lost everything they tried to preserve. The sweetest part of this entire experience wasn't watching them fall, it was watching myself rise. Every A on a difficult exam, every research project, I contribute to every young woman I mentor who refuses to accept limitations placed on her because of her gender. That's the real victory. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever experienced family favoritism that made you question your own worth? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent about injustice or risking everything to expose the truth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is share our experiences and let others know they're not alone. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama and justice stories. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's limitations, even when those people are family. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue sharing these important stories. Thank you all for being part of this journey with me. Remember, your dreams are valid, your potential is limitless, and sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let anyone else define your future. Keep fighting for what you deserve and never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you are. The truth will always win in the end. Sometimes it just takes a little courage to set it free.